Buenas tardes a todos, soy Silvia Inclán del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales y les agradezco que nos acompañen el día de hoy por nuestro canal en el primer evento del programa académico de las celebraciones de los 90 años del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales de la UNAM. Estamos de fiesta, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Antes de presentar a nuestros invitados, quiero hacer unos anuncios importantes con respecto a la conferencia de hoy. La sesión se va a llevar a cabo en inglés y será transmitida en vivo. Posteriormente, estará a disposición una versión subtitulada en español. No obstante, si tienen preguntas hoy, nos la pueden hacer llegar en inglés o en español, en cuyo caso yo las traduciré, y les pido que por favor las envíen por la vía del chat de la transmisión del canal de YouTube. Comenzamos entonces. Good afternoon to everyone following our channel today, and thank you for joining us in the first event of the academic program of the celebrations of the 90th anniversary of the Institute for Social Science Research at UNAM. For today's celebration, we have a conference by one of the world's leading social theorists of our times, an influential mind when it comes to understanding culture, cultural sociology, cultural power, civil society, civic sphere, civic order, society, social theory, and democracy, to name just a few of the topics he is an academic reference on. Working in the areas of theory, culture, and politics, he's one of the exponents of the strong program in cultural sociology at Yale University, where he is Lillian Chavenson Professor of Sociology. It is an honor to have you with us, Professor Jeffrey Alexander. Good afternoon. The title of Professor Alexander's talk today is The Populist Continuum from Within the Civic Sphere to Outside It. Professor Alexander, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to speak to you this evening, although I prefer to be there in person, about a problem that concerns not only the people of our two nations, but people around the world. In what I'm going to say today, I'm drawing from an introduction that I wrote for a book called Populism in the Civil Sphere, which will be published in a few weeks by Polity Press. It's co-edited with Peter Cavisto and Giuseppe Shortino, and it contains 10 original essays about global populism, including one by your Mexican colleague and my friend Nelson Artiega, who only recently returned to his position with you after spending a year in New Haven at the Center for Cultural Sociology. So let me now begin. A specter is haunting contemporary societies. Its name is populism, in quotation marks, because scholars can't agree about what it is. Except for one thing, populism is a deviation from democracy, the source of the precarious position so many Western and Eastern, Northern and Southern societies find themselves in today. In this lecture, I will argue that populism is not a democratic deviation, however, but rather a naturally occurring dimension of every democratic society. In moral terms, it can be good or bad, a force for democratic civil repair, or a force that undermines its very possibility. Populism is a continuum stretching from the political left to the right, which is fatal to democracy only on the extremes. I'm going to ask Fernando to put up this PowerPoint slide briefly so you get a sense of what I'm talking about. I'm going to try to fill out conceptually what this diagram really means. And then I'm going to come back to it right at the end of the lecture and ask Fernando to put it back up on the screen. But I don't need it anymore. Thanks. I want to argue that the effort to properly understand populism depends on better comprehending contemporary democracies and their discontents. Sociologists have rarely been interested in theorizing democracy. That seems peculiar, but I think it's correct. And when they have done so, they have had great difficulty understanding the cultural and institutional complexities that can sustain democracy and also destroy it. Like the extreme populists who are the civil sphere's enemies, sociologists have reduced democracy to material interests, to the masses against the elites, to the battle of less privileged over more privileged classes, to the flourishing of grassroots movements against institutions and states, and to the triumph of public altruism over private greed. The premise of this lecture is that civil sphere theory offers a better perspective. Since democratic political theory first emerged 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, it has rested upon the Socratic notion that virtues like rationality, honesty, altruism, cooperation, autonomy, and liberty are the fundaments of democratic life. Civil sphere theory sees such qualities, by contrast, not as existential virtues upon which governments can be built, but rather as cultural structures central to a democratic discourse. They are powerful signifying references which have to be instantiated in social life via symbolic performances and communicative and regulative institutions. Civil sphere theory does not conceptualize democracy, moreover, only as a governmental structure, but rather, in John Dewey's words, as a way of life. Excuse me. Democratic life depends less on voting procedures and legal rights in and of themselves than on the social existence of a performatively compelling, emotionally vital, and morally universalizing sphere of solidarity, one in which feelings for others whom we will never meet fuels moral recognition and emotional compassion. It is only upon the basis of such a moral and emotional form of civil community, I believe, that the all-important communicative and regulative institutions of democracy can be sustained. Now, because populism is highly polarizing, it has the phenomenological effect of conducing anxiety that such civil solidarity is breaking apart. Left populists often feel as if civil solidarity is an illusion, that democratic discourse is a fig leaf for private interests, and that the social and cultural differentiation that vouchsafes the independence of the civil sphere merely reflects the hegemony of narrow professional interests or those of the ruling class. Right populists often share the same distrust, even repulsion, for the civil sphere. What seems civil to the center and left, like affirmative action or open immigration, the right calls out as particularistic. Honored civil icons such as Holocaust and civil rights memorials, they trash. Can the sense of a vital civil center survive such criticism and censure from populism on the left and on the right? Only if civil solidarity can regulate ideal and material conflict in such a manner that enemies become frenemies can sharp antagonism be moderated so that agonism thrives. Populist rhetoric on both the left and the right is inflammatory in tone and demagogic often in style, but is it actually anti-democratic, as many social scientific students of populism have so often claimed? I don't think so. Populists rail against false news, so-called false news, and vested interests that hide the truth, describing only their own side as rational, independent, and honest. Populists call opponents enemies and liars. They attack their opponents as selfish and brag relentlessly about their own generosity. Populists came to expose secret conspiracies against the people, portraying themselves or parties and their governments as transparent and responsive, as open for all to see. Populists attack elites and privilege, dividing society into us and them, aligning themselves with the people. They vow to drastically change what they see as biased and polarizing rules of the social and political game. Yet, while these snapshots of democratic drama can be decidedly alarming, certainly in a normative sense, empirically, they are far from being deviations. Rather, they are part and parcel of every civil sphere. What we are seeing and hearing is the binary discourse that has from the beginning dynamized and polarized, enabled and constrained political and social life in actually existing civil spheres. Throughout the histories of modern democracies and ancient ones as well, populist leaders on both right and left have worked the binaries to suggest that their opponents are civilly incapable, that only they themselves are willing and able to act on behalf of the people's side, to be rational, autonomous, open, cooperative, and altruistic. Thus, only their side allows solidarity and liberty to be maintained or restored. The clear and present danger that extreme, radically populist movements pose to contemporary democracies does not emerge from such rhetoric, pitting the putatively civil against the uncivil. It comes rather when such simplistic, sometimes very upsetting, and inveterate binaryism is employed to constrain the autonomy of civil sphere institutions, the ones that sustain democratic life. The making and unmaking of civil solidarity, its expansion and contraction, depend on connecting the sacred democratic and profane authoritarian sides of democratic discourse to ongoing events and struggles in particular places and times. This is the work of civil institutions. The binary discourse of the civil sphere makes democracy broadly meaningful. What communicative and regulative institutions do is to articulate this abstract language in the here and now. And they must be independent of political leaders and states in order to do so. Public opinion polls, associations, and journalism are what I call the media of communication. They specify democratic values and discourses on behalf of civil solidarity, issuing highly public judgments about the civil and uncivil character of interests, groups, movements, and events, judgments that are in principle independent of political leaders and parties who claim to speak to the people and for the people directly. The other filtering mechanisms, because that's what these are, filtering mechanisms. The other filtering mechanisms of civil spheres are not communicative, but regulative. The institutions, for example, of voting and electoral competition, the impersonal structures of office, and the precedent-bound and rights-based matrices of law. The elites who organize and represent these communicative and regulative institutions are civil sphere agents. In principle, their ideal and material interests coincide with the defense of the autonomy of the civil sphere. Civil sphere agents mediate the charismatic claims of populist leaders and movements, intertwining interpretation and coercion, producing universalizing quasi-factual evidence that can pollute, arrest, and sometimes even incarcerate those who are deemed the civil sphere's anti-democratic enemies. Investigative journalists and crusading attorneys are ambitious for glory, but of a democratic kind. Their hopes to become civil heroes can be stymied by populist demagogues, whether right or left, who believe that only they themselves can speak for the people in immediate rather than mediated ways, as vessels rather than instruments of civil power, as the only true representatives of the general will. When the representational process at the heart of modern struggles for power comes to be centered in a single man or woman, rather than in relatively independent communicative and normative institutions, you have what Weber called Caesarism. When symbolic power is less civil than plebiscitarian, it will be wielded by Gramsci's modern prince, a militant vanguard party that claims to crystallize the voice of the people via their media, their associations, their constructions of polls, their judges, and their courts. Buoyed by their presumption to speak for the people, radically populist demagogues seek not only to monopolize the communicative power of symbolic representation, but also to destroy the organizational autonomy of regulative institutions. Radical populists cannot tolerate independent courts interpreting and applying civil discourse. They cannot allow independent media elites to decide who and what is more rational, more honest, or more true on the one hand, and more secretive, hidden, and threatening on the other. The ethical universalizing regulation of office is deeply compromised as well. When power becomes personal and familial, and corruption becomes quotidian, not deviance, but everyday life. Patrimonial domination, a cult of deference, and fusion of the leader's mystical and earthly bodies are alternatives to civil power, to constitutionally regulated office, and to the critical and independent communicative and regulative mediation that underpins what Faber named the ethic of responsibility. Elections become more like spectacles than moral performances, empty showcases for staging dramaturgic authority, instead of occasions for agonistic conflicts over how democratic boundaries can be applied. Under such conditions of discursive construction and institutional fusion, the presuppositions of a universalizing solidarity become severely constrained. Civil spheres shrink, reflecting the primordial qualities of the leader and party who have grabbed representational power. The civil sphere loses its dialectical dynamism. Rather than moving back and forth across the ideological continuum, populism stops at the far left or the far right sides. Instead of continuously shifting moments in the pendulum swing of social and cultural history, populism becomes a punctum, in Barth's sense, a fixed point that halts the movement and breaks the marvelously subtle, powerful but flexible, finely tuned but always precarious machine of democracy. Actually existing civil spheres are far from realizing the civil democratic ideal enshrined in normative theory. The autonomy of real civil spheres is always contested and compromised by modern society's centrifugal parts. The civil sphere promises and helps produce solidarity and democratic integration, yet the non-civil spheres and institutions surrounding it and the internal strains generated by what I call the contradictions of space, time, and function make the expansion of civil solidarity equivocal and the achievement of civil power precarious. The expansion of democratic justice also intertwines with restrictions imposed by classes, regions, religions, ethnicities, genders, sexualities, and races. The historical founders of democratic regimes form elite status groups that seek to restrict civil qualities to certain kinds, namely their own, of ethnicity, race, religion, gender, sexuality, and class. The institutions and values that abut the civil sphere on its boundaries are controlled by elites whose ideal and material interests are non-civil, not necessarily anti-civil, but non-civil. And these often intrude into civil spheres and reconstruct the binary codes so that they more align with the non-civil values that inform the spheres on the civil sphere's boundaries. These structures of civil exclusion and anti-civil domination are continuously challenged by populist movements who can seek to enlarge incorporation and to strengthen civil power. Left populist movements, for example, call out elites. They demand more civil and democratic distributions of economic wealth. They attack racial, religious, ethnic, and regional barriers. They work to purify, in other words, the compromised civil sphere, to overcome fragmentation and polarization in the name of a more civil cohesion and a more virtuous people. Rather than being dangerous to democracy, then, such left populist movements reflect nothing more and nothing less than the everyday processes of actually existing civil spheres. Dividing the virtuous people from corrupt elites can be a powerfully restorative discourse, despite the often overweening simplifications and sanctimonious rhetoric of some progressive groups. Left populist movements, after all, have been at the heart of social liberalism and social democracy, making liberal government into a more democratic way of life. The dangers associated with left populism, which have all too frequently allowed it to be conflated with populism on the far right, have to do, I think, with just how fast and how far it goes. Demands for repairs in the name of the people can become dangerously impatient and increasingly intolerant of those who defend the material and ideal interests of the status quo. Progressive populist leaders can become hungry not only for civil power, but their own. Left populist parties can come to consider themselves a virtuous vanguard. In the name of righteously progressive reform, they can attack the independence of the civil sphere's communicative and regulative institutions, squirming under the pressure of independent criticism and opposing political and legal claims. In this way, I think populism moves from expanding democracy to narrowing it. The class or ethnic or religious communities left populists once represented as deserving of civil incorporation can become new elites that define exclusionary boundaries in their own name. Just such popular inversion has happened, for example, in Turkey. Originally representing the excluded and disempowered Sunni religious majority, the seemingly democratic and civilly oriented AKP promised civil repair and incorporation, and Erdogan, its leader, was widely hailed as a heroic figure of democratic emancipation. Even as the AKP achieved power and initiated reforms, however, this left populism moved to make Sunni Islam into a new and privileged core group, primordializing Turkish national solidarity in an anti-civil way, repressing civil associations, and putting once independent communicative and regulative civil institutions under control of the state. Such a decline from expanding democracy to endangering it is most likely to occur when left populism equates civil repair with social revolution. As a repeated declension of 20th century communism into dictatorship has tragically demonstrated. Reformist movements that initiate policies to enlarge civil capacity can be understood as what I call front-lash movements, occupying a position in social life akin to the role of the avant-garde in art. Leftward social change upends traditional way of life. The life worlds within which civil qualities are experienced and understood, the status elites to whom deference has heretofore been paid, the institutional elites whose competence had guaranteed power and respect. It is along these strained and fearful fault lines that backlash forms. This dialectic of frontlash and backlash is endemic, I believe, to civil repair and democratic life. Reformation, counter-reformation, enlightenment, anti-enlightenment, communism, fascism, secularism, fundamentalism, civil rights, Ku Klux Klan. Radically right populist leaders, for their part, attack the enemy, corruption, and emptiness they find in modern society, promising to restore solidarity and the community we have lost. Nativist and primordial solidarities, which emphasize particular religion, race, or ethnicity, push back against the more cosmopolitan solidarity that has allowed outgroups to be incorporated. Frontlash populism produces backlash populism, whose aim is to constrain, restrict, and roll back recent expansions of the civil sphere. Backlash against progressive changes permeates real existing civil spheres. Conservatism is the rightward movement of a social pendulum that seems to be swinging dangerously to the left to many. Conservative theorists from Burke to Oakeshott have cautioned against the dangers of radical social change, favoring incremental and measured forms of civil repair. Such civil conservatism often has the unintended effect of rebalancing a civil sphere, restoring confidence in the existence of a vital center that allows front-lash movements to live and to fight another day. Such a concern to maintain a vital center is what has distinguished, I think, social democracy of the Second International from communism of the Bolshevik Third International. The critical questions for right and left populism are, as I've mentioned, how far, how fast? Backlash populism can become anti-civil, moving not just to the right, but far to the right, reducing civil standing to core group status, polluting those who until recently were outsiders, inciting street violence, and establishing authoritarian regimes that do not just modulate, but undermine civil values and institutions. In Germany, for example, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, started as an economically conservative Eurosceptic party, only later becoming transformed into a radical right populist movement that is stridently nationalist, pollutes immigrants, attacks cosmopolitan elites, issues anti-Semitic dog whistles, and harkens back to Nazism. In Poland, conservative reaction against the Polish Solidarity movement and the secular cosmopolitan democracy it created eventually became an aggressively divisive, radically anti-civil force. Acting in the name of the, quote, real Polish people, the PIS has attacked the founding elites of the post-communist regime, reduced civil solidarity by equating it with primordial bonds of Catholicism and nationalism, and sharply restricting the autonomy of Poland's communicative and regulative institutions. Endemic to the structure and process of civil spheres, then, populism is a continuum that stretches from the right, from the civil right and left-wing movements to the right and left in authoritarian ways. So you can see that, excuse me, that I've tried to draw a circle around the civil sphere and identified left populism as a civil form of radicalism and right populism as a civil form of conservatism, each of which can sustain rather than undermine the vital center, which, by the way, the vital center is a term that was created by a famous American historian named Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a Harvard professor in the late 1940s, who eventually became associated with liberalism and John F. Kennedy. And then on the outside of the sphere, I wanted to design how the movement of left populism and right populism can become more extreme and assume anti-democratic characteristics. Now, so my argument is that it's not populism in and of itself, but impatience, radicalism, and extremism, and deeply structured blockages to more democratic pathways of repair. It's important not to forget that push populist movements to the far left and right sides of this continuum. inverting the sacred and profane sides of the binary discourse of civil society, repressing the autonomy of civil institutions, and endangering the vital center that civil spheres must sustain or democracy collapses. Now, let me conclude with just a few general considerations. Grand theorizing about, quote, modernity has been typically skeptical about the discourse and practice of liberty, viewing it, modernity, not only as merely formal and empty of moral substance, but as fueling repressive organizational structures like capitalism and bureaucracy. Reification, commodification, rationalization, egoism, and enemy disciplinary power. Such interpretations have been organized around what Paul Ricoeur once described famously as the hermeneutics of suspicion. In some part, this dark narrative accurately reflects the tragic histories of Europe and Latin America, whose civil spheres, deeply scarred and fragmented, have had real difficulties sustaining civil control over communicative and regulative institutions. In some other part, however, such a hermeneutics of suspicion reflects a failure of theoretical and moral imagination, a dearth that has, albeit in a very different manner, extended also to the Anglo-American social theorizing about modernity. In the US and Britain, where democratic life has proved so far more durable than in Europe, macro social theories about democratic modern development are not that easy to find either. Pragmatist, micro-sociological, and meso-level institutional theories are what we find in Britain and the United States, and these have not really been able, I would argue, to translate the social experiences of these democratic societies into persuasive theoretical form. Talcott Parsons tried to provide a sophisticated macro-theoretical alternative, but the theory he produced was blind to the dangers of the dark side of modern life. To provide a better theoretical translation of the social experience of democratic life has been the ambition of civil sphere theory. It's been inspired by the democratic spirit of pragmatism, by the scope of European macro theory, by the failed ambitions of Parsons, and the path of the cultural turn. After the Holocaust had transformed genocide into a universal evil, after the Black civil rights movement in the United States and South Africa had mounted mammoth movements against racial domination, after second wave feminism had laid down the challenge to patriarchy, civil sphere theory emerged in the wake of 1989 as a wave of democratic optimism swept the world. The overthrow of state communism in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and of right-wing authoritarianism in Latin America, offered an object lesson in liberty. If not the end of history, it seemed that a new golden age of democracy had surely begun. But as Hegel wrote, history is cunning, and that new age of equipoise proved short-lived. Over the course of the last decade, the third decade after the magical one launched in 1989, there has been growing moral unease, emotional anxiety, and social instability. Feeding off this combustible bile, anti-democratic movements have flourished. Newly liberal governments have become illiberal democracies. And in even the most stable democratic, capitalist, and social democratic nations' liberty has become threatened. Civil spheres can become popularized into anti-democratic governments. But such transformative destruction does not happen in the blink of an eye. As right-wing and sometimes left-wing forces push backwards or forwards to demagoguery, activists draw from the sustaining cultural and institutional powers of civil spheres to push back against it. Protecting the vital center, protesters and elites alike can defend the autonomy of critical discourse. The right for journalists and legal authorities to make independent interpretations, and the need for civil power via voting and office to maintain control over the coercive powers of the state. Engaging in social performances to expose the defects of contemporary civil spheres is what populism is all about. The danger is that such protests against injustice will become concentrated, however, in a single leader or party. The representation of civil capacity must be dispersed, not concentrated, distributed among the communicative and regulative institutions that filter, pluralize, and agonistically specify the principles that allow incorporation and exclusion. For as John Dewey argued a century ago, democracy is more than a form of government. Primarily, it is a mode of associational living, of conjoint communicated experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alexander, for your presentation. Now we will pass the microphone to Dr. Fernando Castaños, who's a researcher at our institute and dedicated to the study of democracy with a special interest, or perhaps I should say a passion for theory, discourse, debate, and deliberation. He's also a member of the academic committee organizing the 90th anniversary of the Institute. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Castaños, and for joining us to comment on Professor Alexander's conference. The floor is yours, please.
Yeah. I have no doubt whatsoever that how civil spheres address populisms in the following years will be consequential for the semantics of democracy and henceforth for democracy itself. Max Weber said that social deeds do not merely occur. According to him, they occur and signify, and they often occur because they signify. The understanding of signification we have nowadays is wider and deeper than Weber's, as a result of research on semiological structures, semiotic processes, and pragmatic principles that has been carried out in different disciplines and in several interdisciplinary domains. But precisely because of that, Weber's dictum is even more relevant than it was in his time. We now know that the ways individual human beings live their lives depend on the language games they play, and these depend on their semantic environments. Cultural sociology has given us key insights into how those semantic environments are shaped and validated by societies. And Jeffrey Alexander has been the main promoter of this strand of sociological thinking. The studies he and his followers have conducted on social and civilization traumas have revealed that the effects of natural or historical disasters on social bonds and on political structures cannot be explained by their magnitude alone. attribution of preventive and reparatory agency, or conviction that agentive will or capacity lacked count as much, if not more, than the scale of damage produced. This, along with collective accountability, determines which disasters are more memorable and lead to change. The question that is at stake is if the damage was a necessary consequence of the disaster, whether or not it would have been avoided had the government acted well beforehand, or at least reacted well at the time. And when that question is posed, it is recognizing or failing to see that all members of society have some responsibility for the discursive paths that give access to power, which matters most. One conjunction of answers to these two issues links disaster to elite or even regime replacement. Think about Mexico City's 1985 earthquake. The other combinations lead to the disaster being used as an excuse for public resources abuse, to its being depicted as an accident exaggerated by the media, or to its becoming a lingering nightmare for all. That is why narration of and argumentation about disasters are so important for political actors. In those arenas, they dispute agency attribution, blame, and duty, and by so doing, they lay claim to legitimate representation. And of course, such entitlement avowals and their counterparts, dismissals of opponents, involve identity construction contests, which in turn call for the appropriation of descriptions and names. I find the approach very compelling. Telling, talking into, depicting, calling. These are the main components of deliberations, negotiations, confrontations, and alignments within the political sphere. And they are also the main resources of communication between this realm and the civil sphere, which is paramount in a democracy. Indeed, only in the civil sphere can democratic legitimacy judgments be established. The point is that discourses which configure political options ought to be received and processed by networks of persons who need not obey politicians. Only when they know that they are regarded by others as free, and when they see the others as equally entitled to their own views, will they be convinced that defeated options had a fair chance, which is a precondition for a decision to be accepted by a sufficient number of citizens who do not agree with it. And by accepting it, plurality and respect are endorsed as coexisting values. One might be drawn to a corollary. A democratic political sphere and a properly civil sphere sustain each other. And I believe convergent theses would stem from democratic theory and from discourse studies. However, populist discourses originating in the political sphere pose some problems. Not only can they put this sphere's order into question, but they can also threaten the reciprocal recognition of persons with different political views that signals civility in the other sphere. The puzzle is bigger than it seems at first. At least since Francisco Panizza's studies of what he called neo-populism in the 1980s, there is evidence that the surge of populism does initially require conditions we would qualify as democratic, or perhaps minimally democratic. It can only start growing if the free communicative flow that allows for the political civil connection obtains. But more than that, populism does point to democratic deficits, and democracy is predicated on the possibility of self-critique. If naming, describing, narrating, and arguing cannot be directed at the regime's failures, then it is not yet, or not anymore, a democracy. Jeffrey Alexander has now offered us an invaluable clarifying reflection, which tells us that the relations between democracy and populism are even tenser and yet less paradoxical than they seemed. My summary of the main ideas I have retained after a first study of his paper are as follows. The civil sphere is receptive of populist discourse because this is rooted in values that are dear to persons concerned with civility, such as inclusion. Moreover, populist discourse can originate in the civil sphere itself. It can start as a voicing of its members' dissatisfaction with politics, and it can be directed at the civil sphere's own defects. In other words, it can be an expression of collective responsibility. For example, some persons could see that certain moves aimed at countering some exclusion are actually producing other exclusions, and therefore protest what was born as a response to protests from the other side. Hence, to talk about populism as if it were a homogeneous category could be misleading. It would be more fruitful to conceive it as a continuum of breeds, stretching from an extremely conservative one to an extremely radical one. And it is the right and left extremes which undermine democracy, but those varieties that gravitate around the center can revitalize democracy. When Alexander issues these views, he is engaging in a dialogue between advocates of liberalism, mainly in Anglo-American traditions, and skeptics of this doctrine, mainly within European currents. He is also inviting further debate on insufficiently theorized matters. Following on such leads and trying to stay within our time limits, I'll end up by asking myself 3 questions that will guide my second reading of Alexander's paper and certainly my reading of the whole book he has co-edited. I'm looking forward to it, and I will surely start with Nelson Arteaga's paper on Mexico's case. Naming, describing, narrating, and arguing within the civil sphere often produce semantic oppositions. These can be dichotomous, for example, friend and enemy, or continuous, for example, left and right. If we call both types binaries, will it not be difficult for us to see afterwards which of these is more likely to undermine pluralism? This is my first question. Now, the idea of good and bad populism seems to lead to the idea of good and bad populists. Could this not in turn lead, especially in presidential democracies, to the more dangerous idea that ends justify means? Second question. And if center-left and center-right populisms revitalize democracy, is it perhaps because they are in principle democratic, not because they are populists? Last question. I am sure the audience will now also ask themselves how the meanings of populism and democracy interact and how those interactions open up or close down options for democracy. We all have populist feelings, and that is so for good reasons. Besides, populist discourse is frequent all over the world, and Jeffrey Alexander's lecture has provided us with sharp optics to observe what is happening and what is about to happen. It is most fortunate that he has offered his presentation on the opening of the academic program to celebrate our Institute's 90th anniversary. We are very, very grateful to him. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Silvia.
Thank you, Dr. Castaños. If Professor Alexander and you agree to it, I will, well, I don't have any questions yet, but I will pass the microphone to Dr. Alexander so he can react to your questions first, and then we'll go to those of the audience. Is that fine with you?
Yes, sure.
So, Professor Alexander, please.
Well, thank you very much, Fernando. This was a very, very subtle and compact reconstruction of various elements in my work, the cultural sociology, the civil sphere, and also the trauma theory, which I eliminated, which is in the introduction, but I eliminated for reasons of time from my verbal presentation. And I would like to say that constructing a sense of a danger to society and communicating who are the people responsible for the danger and who are the victims is, I think, a really central process in creating populism. And it has been from the beginning. Not only, for example, the natural disasters like an earthquake, but social disasters like depressions, losses of war, corruption scandals, etc. So I think that's an important part of the process of polarization. You mentioned, so I want to thank you simply for that, for the elegance of your comment. In terms of the questions you noted at the end, I mean, you mentioned that the semantic oppositions between right and left and the various binaries is, if you call these binaries left populism, right populism, how do you know which is more likely to undermine democracy or not? And the second question you ask is whether distinguishing good and bad populism might lead in presidential systems to arguments that the ends justify the means. Now, to both of these things, I'd simply say yes, that in empirical social life, the fact that struggles inside the civil sphere are organized around moral binaries of bad and good is dangerous, and it does make it more difficult to claim that the ends that the ends don't justify the means. I mean, that's why we have this continuous collapse of empirical democracies, because the very logic by which the civil sphere is sustained is a binary logic, and that binary logic can come back and bite itself in a way. It can undermine its own commitment to a more expansive civil solidarity. Because if you can persuasively identify, let's say, the elites who control the media or the legal elites who make decisions, or the elites who control the voting process as bad and anti-civil, then you can create or try to create a social movement that will destroy the autonomy of those elites and put them under the control of a populist party. In fact, that's the logic by which left-wing and right-wing movements on the extremes have in fact undermined the cosmopolitan nature of civil spheres. I think that's, but that isn't necessary. You know, that's why I wanted to distinguish in my argument a civil left populism from an extreme left populism, and a civil conservatism from a radical anti-civil. Of course, these are my own labels, but it's very difficult on the left, for example, and I consider myself part of the left in the United States. People hate, everybody is so, we're all upset about conservatism. So people, you know, we organize in elections and social movements to defeat conservatives. But in doing so, we are not mindful of the fact that conservatism can be a positive force if it remains civil, if it respects the rights of people it's supposed to, and that it can have the effect of slowing down the front-lash movements which can destabilize. So while I would prefer to have a civil left in power, I think the challenge or the test of a democracy really is whether the pendulum can swing from the left to the right and back again without undermining the process of democracy itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Alexander. I have two more questions from our audience. The first question from Octavio Perez Rangel. Could you give us an example of a civil democratic restoration from populism in Latin America? And the second question from Luz Ángela Cardona. How does the theory of the civil sphere contribute to a theory of democracy?
Okay, the first question is, can I give an example in Latin America of a recovery from an anti-civil populism or a left populism or a right populism? Which one? Any populism?
Any. It doesn't say.
I mean, to me, what happened in Latin America in the 80s and 90s is an example of a recovery from mostly far-right populist movements who took over, who tried to defend a narrow and primordial version of solidarity against left populism that had, I think, been too avant-garde, given the structure and cultural processes of Latin America. So they had undermined democracy and created authoritarianism throughout the hemisphere. So an interesting question then is, how did a relatively independent civil sphere come about to create some aspects, some vital aspects of a center and of democratic procedures? to me, so this isn't, to me, an example of, and there are many examples of that in the Southern Cone, of a democracy being resurrected out of the ashes of far-right populist authoritarianism.
Okay.
And I think that you see the same thing happening today in a halting way in terms of, what might come out of left-wing populist authoritarianism in some Latin American societies.
Okay. We have two more questions.
I don't think I answered the second question.
Yeah, you did still have.
But I forgot what it was.
The second is, how does the theory of the civic sphere contribute to a theory of democracy?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I published an 800-page book, which is in Spanish. It came out in Spanish a year or two ago, called The Civil Sphere, where I tried to make that argument, and I'd like you to take a look at it. But in summary, democracy has not been a topic, in my opinion, for the great classics of sociology, either classics or moderns. Progressive people have mainly been concerned, progressive sociologists, with equality, with redistribution, and with conflicts over distribution. That, I think, is a failure of the imagination, because what allows there to be struggles over distribution is what is the existence of democracy, what Seymour Martin Lipset called democracy a democratic class struggle. When political scientists, so my understanding, and it may not be at all true in Mexican-American social science, but my understanding is democracy has mainly been a topic in political science, and of course the great tradition of political theory. But the great tradition of political theory has a very narrow view of democracy as deliberative and dialogical, and is based on virtues in the sense of the Republican, so-called Republican tradition that starts with ancient Greece and goes through, the early modern society, Machiavelli, etc. But empirical political science is a problem because it's so institutionally focused on voting and on law, and of course on the composition of political parties. Civil sphere theory, I would like to think, is a deeper and broader understanding of democracy, because it brings in structures of feeling, emotion, meaning, and symbolic processes without neglecting institutions, but rather developing a new understanding of what institutions do.
Yeah, thank you. We have one more by Cristina Puga. She says, you spoke about the end of utopia. Could you elaborate further?
Well, I think I was referring to the illusion that utopia had ended after 1989, which was the notion of the end of ideology, and because the great conflict between communism and supposedly the conflict between communism and capitalism was over. Capitalism, or however, or you could say democratic capitalism, had won. That was what a lot of people, new ideologists were arguing this. But I don't think utopianism is dead. I mean, my theory of the civil sphere is that the civil sphere is actually a utopian ideal that can never be realized in an actually existing society. So, and that comes partly from simply an empirical reading that discontent and self-criticism is a continuous part of every semi-democratic society. But it also comes from my argument about the relative autonomy of culture that comes out of the strong program in cultural sociology. Parsons believed that when values were institutionalized, they created equilibrium. I believe that when culture is institutionalized, it creates dissatisfaction and the continuous struggling to realize ideals. And so I don't think utopias are dead.
Okay, thank you. We have another one. Ricardo Tirado says, I think populism shows that the linguistic discourse is stressed by very powerful symbols and myths, which are easy to analyze. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know what you mean by easy to analyze. I think it's always hard to analyze myths. It takes a lot of skill to reconstruct collective meanings, a lot of patience to engage in thick description like Clifford Geertz talks about. But I do agree that populism is, it's fueled by, for example, deep myths about the nation. I mean, every nation, like your nation, Mexico, is so deeply embedded still in the myth, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but in a narrative about the revolution. That's the basis of modern democratic Mexico, and that propels populism, and it makes more technocratic efforts at a technocratic presidency in Mexico much less legitimate, because the revolutionary idea is in fact a deep myth. Of course, there are other myths. I mean, these myths are things that are taken for granted. In the United States, there's a lot of myths that propel, for example, right-wing populism. The myth of the whiteness myth, the myth of colonizing, of the superiority of Christianity. But then against that, there are very deep democratic myths here too, in terms of a founding covenant from the Revolution, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. The Civil Rights Movement is another myth that is important to left-wing populism.
Okay, thank you, Professor Alexander. You have addressed all of, we don't have any more questions. You've addressed them all so far. And well, I am just very grateful, the same as our audience. We don't have any more questions, but we have a list of congratulations for a great talk, and celebrating the fact that the topic is addressed from sociology, which is not very common. And we're all looking forward to reading your upcoming book. So I thank you, Dr. Castaños, as well, for his participation. And well, I'll leave you to the floor open if you want to make some concluding remarks.
Well, this has been very stimulating for me. It's a great honor, and it's really a pleasure to be part of the 90th anniversary of UNAM, which is such a fabulous institution, one I've always admired, and I congratulate you on surviving and thriving in your first 90 years and look forward to many more. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. We also thank our participants and the audience for your questions and participation. Thank you very much, Dr. Alexander. And
Stay
Dr.
well.
Castaños.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando.